We're going to get started here in just a moment, but it's always a pleasure to do these things, especially when I find myself giving talks that result from me being really hoist on my own petard, where a thing I've been doing lately is talking about how things in our databases can be misused as databases. And somewhere along that line, it's, oh, Corey, let's do some data. Let's talk about a database. And then I start looking at Scylla, and I was kind of horrified to realize, oh crap, this is actually a database. And it's one of those, oh, good. Now I get to have that conversation, and it's going to, it's hard to misuse a database as a database. Not that some companies aren't trying, but now I'm going to be learning a little bit more and having conversations for the next hour with Dor. Dor,
Mhm.
you're the CEO of Scylla. Thank you for having me on. By all means, let's talk a little about what we're going to talk about today.
Hi, Corey. I'm super excited to speak with you. It's wonderful to follow you with all of your tweets. I bet you have another twin who tweets right now, but yeah, let's go ahead and dive in.
All right. So we start off with a glorious, we start off with a title slide, of course, and the whole direction we're moving in, which is the question of open source versus proprietary. I know that during their keynote at the beginning of reInvent, which was something like 85 weeks ago now, because it never ended, and they were talking about how companies are choosing open source databases. And the way that they were framing it felt very much like it was like people are choosing this for high level reasons where they're going through it's an ideology. We're really interested in the future of open source. I have a different take on that, and that people aren't looking to be locked into license fees. Like, forget architectural and technical lock-in. They don't want accounting lock-in. And I think that, I don't know if the term open source is the right answer for that, but the idea of at least theoretical portability, where there's not a single vendor answer and that's it for something as core to what you're doing as a database, is what people care about. What's your take on it?
So I bet we can talk about it all day long, and there are multiple aspects of it. Uh, Sometimes there's just flexibility that people need. It's not just one vendor with one database. You'd like to have customization. Even within open source databases, there are database libraries, sometimes open source database libraries that you can build your own database, like Foundation DB, which is a library. It's not a DB. It's a Foundation DB library. It should add, and RocksDB, and there are other options. So there are a lot of things that influence open source. The thing is that usually you do want to go away from being locked in because of variety of things, and also to have more options. Like if, for example, customization monitoring, you don't want to be locked in by your vendor. So it's a good thing to go towards open source. That's why, like all organizations, I used to work at Red Hat, and it was really funny. Every year at the Red Hat Summit, then the CTO and would come in and say, we're kind of carrying the open source flag. Microsoft is after us, but years afterwards, and that's it. Open source won the game. We need to make sure that open source is used for the right things. There are lots of value in open source, but also that there are also value in as a service. So sometimes they go together, sometimes they do not. We're here to offer something that's unique. Usually vendors like AWS take open source component and provide them as a service, and they do a really good job about it. The problem is that they make other vendors, the open source vendors, struggle to monetize. And that's a problem, and it pushes the vendors to modify the version of their licenses.
And that's
Um,
awful for everyone. I think that at some point, a lot of these vendors got confused and mistook open source for a business model. And it's frankly not. And for a long time, it was understandable. There was this idea that, well, I wrote the software, therefore I'm going to be the best person to operate this, full stop. And it turns out that hyperscalers are very, very good at operating complex things at scale. And on some levels, where people are starting to fork their licenses to source available style stuff, it's unfortunate, because it's on some level, it seems like it's a purely defensive play, and on others, it almost feels like it's an attempt at bad marketing. It's, oh, you're making your license source available. Who are you again? Oh, it's adorable. You really think a hyperscaler is going to take what you've done and turn it into a product? I You should be so lucky at some point becomes the outcome of those discussions. And if there's one thing that open source people love, it's getting angry about things in the open source world. And I get it. There's no better way for a bunch of software engineers to get to cosplay as attorneys about things they don't fully understand, but by God, do they have opinions on them. And it leads to a whole bunch of noise around these things. But what's interesting to me about Scylla is that you folks haven't gone down that path. And well, for all appearances, it looks to the casual observer who only has the haziest understanding of what an actual database is, that you're doing very well. So how do you view it?
So it's definitely not simple path, and I can relate to vendors who open everything, and I also can relate to vendors who are scared and close everything. There are variety. There is a phrase in English that there are multiple ways you can. What do you do to the cat? You fry the cat or you skin a cat. Yeah. So it's possible to be very successful with open source. You can see that with MongoDB and other vendors, and we want to go after their footsteps. And there are others who just develop software. Sometimes the software can be very successful, but won't end up with a business model, not surprisingly. But it's hard to come up with the right business models. I think that good success with the community will follow with business success, not in 100% of the cases. We like to be very consistent and not modify our license every day. We took a decision to use AGPL not just because of to be protective of as a protection of the cloud vendors and the other software giants, but also because I think that it's the right model where it forces the contribution back to the project, and it reduces fork. It's GPL is a healthy thing. It's not a cancer. Even Microsoft learned that to love Linux. So we're trying to be very consistent and not change our licensing. I hope we won't change it ever, and it will continue to play well. And we have also more multiple flavors of licenses. For example, for the database itself, we use AGPL, and we have a library for our core engine called C-Star, asynchronous engine, and it's licensed Apache, so people will be able to use it and form it into a variety of ways. Today, a Kafka rewrite is being it's already a product by a company called Vectorize, for example. So we like options. And going back to the database, practically we re-implement Cassandra. And Cassandra was followed after the Dynamo paper. So Cassandra was meant to be some sort of open source Dynamo paper. We followed that and improved Cassandra. And we came back to the Dynamo API because it's lucrative and it's valuable API. And in databases, many times you don't want another database. So we kind of re-engineered the internal, but we like to keep the API the same to just provide more options to users. So we open source the DynamoDB API of ours. It's compatible, and folks can do whatever they like with it.
When you talk, well, first, it's always great seeing these papers get implemented and re-implemented. The big tech companies having these breakthroughs and white papering it is great. The Dynamo paper is a terrific example of it. Sometimes it's misunderstood, like when Google wound up doing the white paper on MapReduce, which I can only assume was a great, perfectly executed April Fool's Day prank. Hadoop out of Yahoo went for that hook, line, and sinker, and we're all still paying the price almost 20 years later. The Dynamo paper, on the other hand, has led to a lot of innovation in that space, as you say, through Cassandra. And now going back to the idea of being compatible at an API layer with DynamoDB is fascinating across a whole bunch of different levels. I like Dynamo. I use it myself badly, but the fact that it's always been a bit of tension when I don't believe in some level of multi-cloud and building workloads day one to be portable anywhere, but you also don't intentionally make choices that constrain you at the same time. And Dynamo has been super handy, great at a lot of different things, but it also means that on some level, until now, you were committing to being on AWS, which whenever you pick a cloud provider, you're committing. But you're also now, okay, if I want to leave, not only do I have the standard migration, but I have to redo the data architecture of my application when the constraints shift, when I start addressing that data store differently. And that is a type of lock-in that I try to avoid. It's nice that there is now, if nothing else, a strategic exodus path, which if you achieve nothing else, you have made me feel better about choosing to build things on top of Dynamo because it's not a with my shield or on it story.
Yeah, we're kind of try to provide value either for Dynamo users who want to stick to AWS, we have a better offering, but also and many times it could be that that'll be the like one of our major adopters still uses Dynamo on AWS, but many decided that they need on-prem. That company, I'll move a little bit in our deck of ours. It's GE Healthcare. They sell devices for the healthcare industry, and these devices need to be not in a data. The patient won't be coming to the data center. They'll come to hospital, and they want to have the same API, and they do not want to duplicate the same API to redo it. It makes sense to have a single API, and we enable that. We go ahead.
I just want to point out how great it is to have a reference customer like GE Healthcare, because it's, especially when you talk about things like databases, I'm a grumpy old Unix sysadmin because it's the only kind of Unix sysadmin there ever exists. And my problem has always been that if we look at it through that lens, that there's going to be we're going to have some new technology. Where are the things I want to innovate on? The database is absolutely last on the list because mistakes will show. Sure, I can play around with web servers and do zany things. As long as they're stateless, I can revert to something that works. With databases, it's very often, well, the reversion, if you can even do it, takes days. And very often your disaster recovery strategy is to keep your resume updated at all times. Whereas, and so sure, your reference customer is Twitter for pets. Good for you. I wrote this code last night. It's probably fine. Let's YOLO it into production and see what breaks. GE Healthcare is the exact opposite of that, where this is stuff where consequences matter. Their outage stories do not look like, well, we couldn't show ads to people for some period of time. This is a very serious company with very serious consequences as a result, and thus are very seriously regulated. And the fact that they will use something like Scylla is one of the best testaments that you can possibly have. I'm usually pretty down on customer references. It's like the modern form of the peer thing. Oh yeah, social proof. I know what I'm doing. I'm good. Just ask someone else who I've introduced you to. I tend to view it as a little silly. Something like this is one of those cases where it positively makes sense. I'm a huge fan of that reference. Sorry to interject that, but it's one of those things I really can't emphasize enough.
Thanks a lot. Indeed, they're fabulous customer powers and a really great use case. We didn't imagine to go on-prem and in the healthcare that soon. We also had another surprising thing where we partnered with AWS themselves because AWS are going on-prem with Outpost. So they provide Outpost and you can consume the really great AWS API, EC2 and everything else in racks, but you cannot fit DynamoDB because DynamoDB was meant to be like a giant beast that it's not just a single thing, like a single entity that you can install in a single server like Scylla. it depends on variety of stuff, and it makes sense. This is what you do when you have a data center in a cloud, in your cloud provider. And this is where we come in, and we provide the same API on an AWS Outpost. So it's really easy to use the same API on an AWS data center or within an Outpost. So that was another kind of a surprising quick move that happened.
I have to say I love AWS Outposts, not for what it says, but for what it can't say without being incredibly insulting. But I love it anyway, which is we're a cloud provider and we believe that running things in the cloud is best. However, we understand that in the fullness of time we might get there, but today not everyone is on board with that. So I look at our customers' data centers and what is the biggest problem we see? That you cheap out on hardware and then you managed it like crap. So we figured out that by sending an Outpost, like we buy the hardware and we handle the management plane and ship that out. Great. Now all you can screw up is the power, which of course customers immediately take to with gusto. But it's the idea of trying to meet customers where they are in a bunch of different ways. And it is fascinating on some level that they didn't implement their own actual Dynamo on these things and instead reached out to you folks to do this on a partner basis. I have to say, I did not expect that or see it coming.
Mm-hmm. Me neither, but they're a flexible organization, and they can co-opt it, or how you say that word, and it's good. And at the end, it's some of it is their win, some of it will be our win. It's good. It's a good step for the industry, and there aren't tons of really good options to run your own data, to run software on-prem. So it makes a valuable solution. And finally, we're the single NoSQL solution that AWS Outpost has today, this single certified thing that comes with it. And
oh yeah, and the fact that you can wind up getting that and getting it provisioned rapidly without the approach that you're otherwise going to be constrained to, which is, okay, I want to have this on-prem. Great. So what I need to do now is spin up an instance and then take the software, build it myself, manage it myself, shove it all in. This is one of the things that irritates me the most when I talk to engineers about things like this, where they view this as, well, it's sure, I don't want to deal with lock-in, and load balancers, for example, work differently in every provider. So I'm going to find a way to go ahead and build my own load balancer in a virtual machine and use that. And first, I'm not even going to pay a vendor because I don't want to spend too much money. First, your time isn't free. And I really wish that those of us who came up by doing this in our spare time out of love and then turned into a career realize that at some point, yeah, it's when I'm doing this after school in the evenings, my time is very much free. As a working professional to whom I am paid by my employer so I can afford to eat, the exact opposite is true. And paying for something rather than building it myself is incredibly valuable. Secondly, you also look at these things of, in that story, I don't know what your company does, but I'm going to guess that if I read your mission statement, it says absolutely nothing about building your own load balancers unless you're, I don't know, F5. And at that point, maybe instead of doing the thing that adds no differentiated value, you wind up turning to someone who is an expert at that case. Like I'm talking about load balancers. Let's talk about databases. You should not build your own database, full stop. The exception is if you're a database company, in which case then I will soften that to, you probably shouldn't build your own database. But at that point, it's the core competency. Do that. And if it's not in line with that, why are you taking that on yourself? You don't need to own your entire software supply chain in the way that a lot of, I guess, engineering focused people think they do. I love tinkering. I love building things. But at some point, I need to get my job done, and having experts who will do this way better than I will is well worth spending money on.
Well, it's many engineers are opinionated. Sometimes it's like you need to go to the right flight and not take every flight you may have. And I totally agree with you that as a service, up to a certain scale, works really great, and you just need to use services off the shelf. But some engineers like to build. Sometimes it's also good to have a build culture. We see, for example, that we provide as a service, we provide open source, and we provide enterprise subscription that people install and manage on their own. And the biggest place where people manage Scylla on their own, enterprise Scylla, paid Scylla, is on AWS. And we have a service on AWS. But they still love to manage it on their own, and because of engineering reasons. Instead of fighting with it, we'll just do like we'll provide options, and people will decide whatever is good for them. We can recommend up to a certain point. The whole thing about serverless and services, sometimes it makes sense, sometimes it doesn't, but engineers do need freedom. Sometimes it leads to efficiency, sometimes it's the other way around. But so more, everything exists.
It does. And it's easy to sit here and give best practices tips, but fundamentally a customer knows their workload and their constraints better than anyone who doesn't work there does. You have to make the right decision for yourself. Just make sure you're making that decision based upon the right reasons.
Mm-hmm. True. When we jumped over, when we talked about lock-in, then there's the thing about locking with AWS, which is different than traditional locking, like Oracle. What's your view on it?
I think that lock-in in the legacy IT world, when you pick a vendor and you decide that, all right, I'm going to go with this vendor all the time, you are going to be ridden like a metaphorical pony. And you wind up paying way too much. They basically more or less have you cornered. And it's very hard to break free of that. And people carried that forward into cloud. There were a bunch of questions early on of, well, if my cloud provider raises prices or goes out of business or does something that I don't like or becomes a competitor, and there's a whole list of reasons, I need to be able to move off of it. And I was right there with these people in 2008 to 2012 or so. And then we watched the industry evolve and we saw what was happening. And at some point, like those fears did not come to pass. And at some point you had a choice to make of, do I move faster by going all in on a vendor and letting them do things? Or do I build some sort of weird shim layer that lets me spread a workload between multiple different places? And the problem that you have with that is, right, I'm going to seamlessly build a workload that can run anywhere, which, makes me feel better about not actually doing that. But I'm terrified of being locked in. Fundamentally, lock-in is not the in the cloud is first, it's already there, but in ways you may not realize. And two, it is not a actual thing that drives people to do cloud migrations. If you take a look at all the big customer wins, it is virtually unheard of that we just won a giant customer from another cloud provider. What was the quote that I heard this week? It's like the IT industry as a whole is either between $2 and $3 trillion a year right now. And the entire public cloud environment is somewhere between 100 to 200 billion. There's a lot more out there than sniping for customers between providers. So the entire story of avoiding lock-in across the board is something that is massively overblown. That said, people don't want to follow down the path of, well, I wound up committing to a database or a data architecture or the things that are really expensive and hard to move. And we've seen public examples of that. Amazon was talking about how they hated Oracle because, well, anyone who's had a conversation with Oracle knows how that plays out. And they were highly motivated to get the hell off of Oracle. And it took them years and building their own database in-house, which again, for most companies don't recommend. And Oracle's talking about this. Oh yeah, they hate us and they think this is crap, but they're still a big customer. That's not telling the story that you think it is. That is a terrifying lock-in story. That's what people want to avoid. And because of the way the proprietary vendors have operated in the database space for as long as they have, whenever you say database, people go on point like, ooh, that's a lock-in concern, isn't it? That is what's interesting about the Scylla /DynamoDB story to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, AWS aren't Oracle, all right. The thing is that you can get locked into a technology, not necessarily just to a single vendor. And it's important to have options, especially if that technology either becomes too expensive or kind of restricts you too much with the use cases that you can use. The thing about also with the AWS lock-in, it's there's a lot of complexity in it, either in the technology stack or also in the billing and in the pricing, where you think that things wouldn't cost so much, and they end up costing a lot, and it's even hard to realize how much things do cost over time.
Very much so. And of course, from my perspective, as a consultant who fixes the horrifying AWS bill for a living, it always comes back to cost sooner or later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's similar thing with a distributed database, where performance is the same concept as price, because we're speaking about dozens of servers, sometimes hundreds of them, and the more performant you are, then you'll be able to run on less harder, and then save a lot of money in this. Let's maybe we can pivot to this back. I just want to, since we have many who may be new to Scylla, I just want to cover Scylla in a nutshell in a super quick way. For those who really want to learn deeper about Scylla, they should go to our website or to our upcoming conference next month. So we rewrote Cassandra from scratch with API compatibility with Cassandra. Later on, we added the DynamoDB compatibility. They're basically the same family, so it was relatively easy to do. The DynamoDB API of ours is native, so it's not something that we glued on top of our database. If I'll stop talking about ourselves for a second, AWS did an interesting opposite thing, where they had DynamoDB and they added the Cassandra layer on top of it. It's initially they haven't disclosed exactly what they done. They said it's AWS managed Cassandra, but after no one understood what they really have under the cover, it was from reading between the lines, it was possible to realize that they added a layer on top of DynamoDB that implements the Cassandra protocol, and you can also see the reverse engineer from the price. Many times, if you like to know how things are done at AWS, you should try to reverse engineer their price. So in our API, Dynamo is native. We're the same team who wrote the KVM hypervisor. That was another open source versus proprietary software interesting story. Scylla is a columnar database, also does key value, and we have a graph database in Janus on top of us. And we can run everywhere, including Kubernetes. We're about to GA our Kubernetes operator that gives plenty of choices. And we have a unique architecture of shards per core, super interesting, lots in the weeds. The magic is by having one thread per core, and then you can run on the largest AWS machines and utilize all of the resources, the CPUs and the amazing NVMe disks. That's why we're faster than 5 to 10x times more than any other NoSQL technology, including DynamoDB too. And to just give a reference, we're not speaking about theoretical technologies, probably services that you use more than one time a day are using Scylla, whether it's gaming or ride hailing or Starbucks or TripAdvisor, et cetera, or like watching or buying sport merchandise like Fanatics. So that's kind of sorry to do a kind of a vendor spiel, but I hope it was as short as possible. And we do, for the one who asked, we do we are a columnar database. You can have short columns, which are key values, and Janus Graph is a separate layer that has the graph logic and saves the data in Scylla is in a short schema. So you can have all of them, and we have plenty of interesting graph use cases, very scalable ones. So if we talked about performance now, let's go back and kind of talk about databases and how to choose the right database. There are so many databases, and it's indeed hard to choose the right ones. Usually, NoSQL and Dynamo itself was invented in order to primarily cope with two things: one, scale and performance and scale, and the other one is availability and disaster recovery. I think it was originally because of a 2003 outage that AWS had that they started to develop Dynamo. Now, the thing is, relational databases are better than NoSQL databases in terms of functionality. So just like that, Scylla is a NoSQL vendor, but we kind of state openly, if you have a small data set that can fit into a single machine and you can run with MySQL or with RDS or even Aurora, go ahead and use them. They're more powerful. Don't use Scylla or don't use other NoSQL databases if it's not right. You need to use these technologies only when the time comes. When you're about to have like a scale problem usually, or an active availability problem. This is where Scylla comes in, and also when DynamoDB comes in. I hope you share the same view as I.
Oh yeah, I think that it's the sign of a pretty crappy vendor when their immediate response to the approach is, oh, so what problem do you have? Great, I'm gonna get a cup of coffee, whatever you prattle on about, whatever. Cool, let me talk about why my product is the right answer for this. Rust evangelists, take note. There are problems with NoSQL. One of them historically has been that you really need to know what your data access pattern is going to look like going into it. If you have no idea, then it's basically build one to throw away and then redo it later. Relational becomes, in many cases, the right answer for that. My approach to picking a database has always been to pick the worst possible thing that is not designed to be a database, such as Amazon's Route 53, which is on its face a DNS service, but that's a key value store. I can misuse that as a database. And another one that I use frequently, and shamefully, is I store a SQLite file in S3, pull it down, make my changes to it, and then store it back up. I'm not actually kidding on that.
Yeah, and that's easy. These are indeed S3, or maybe in a. It's possible to you can store stuff over there, but it's definitely you build your own, and it will be a long journey. Sometimes, like it's not really a OLTP type of database, right? Neither is Elasticsearch, for example. So folks need to indeed knowingly go into the database game. Even within pure standard databases, there are multiple choices. So just to quickly answer Arif, who asked about Cockroach or a NewSQL. So NewSQL is kind of a chimera animal between a NoSQL and between relational databases. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't, because it's really hard. The relational model is meant to run within a single machine, but Cockroach is a great vendor, and they have an impressive deployment. It's also still not as fast as NoSQL. It's heavyweight. It does transactions, and also in terms of the mindset. The Scylla mindset with NoSQL and Shardware Core is to optimize the crap out of your CPU and your NVMe disks, and do everything asynchronously, and sometimes add Linux kernel syscall in order for us to run faster. Cockroach approach is they have more to optimize around the query path around relational queries. This is where they need to, and they put most of the efforts. So we've done a very interesting benchmark that compared Cockroach and Scylla, and where the outcome was that we're way better than Cockroach DB, and that's in terms of performance, and that shouldn't surprise anyone. So if you have a very big scale, you should use definitely Scylla, but not as good Dynamo. But if you have a smaller scale problem, more of I think Cockroach correctly termed themselves, calls themselves distributed SQL. So they support distributed SQL, but the price performance metrics aren't like the price performance that you can get with Scylla. Hope it answered the questions. And about Dynamo itself, there are multiple modes with Dynamo. With Dynamo, the nice thing about Dynamo, this is where it gets its power, is the serverless mode, where it's so convenient to use. You don't need to do any planning ahead of time. It's serverless. You just throw the data in and it's kept, and it's super convenient, and you don't really need to know ahead of time how much usage you're going to have, because you just throw data on it. Yeah, I think, Corey, that you have a nice a use case where this is exactly how you use DynamoDB.
It absolutely is. But before we get into that, I do want to talk about, just briefly to add on to what you said, AWS themselves offer something like 14 different database offerings. And the reason behind, and that none of them are positioned as the right answer, and then there's all the others. Picking a database is inherently about trade-offs, and there is no one magic answer that works for everything. It's what do you want to optimize for, and figure out what that looks like. And all of these databases excel at different things. Oracle excels at revenue extraction. MongoDB excels at losing production data that you really needed. And things like Scylla optimize for other things as well. Traditional SQL databases excel at complicated relationships between different parts of data. NoSQL solutions excel at being very scalable very quickly. But understanding what you need and what the trade-offs you are willing to make, can make, and it makes sense to make, are really what it comes down to for selection. But yes, as you were saying, I do have I have an example architecture, which I swear it is an actual map of what I use to write a newsletter every week that goes out last week in AWS, that gathers news from Amazon's cloud ecosystem and gently and lovingly makes fun of it. And every time I show this diagram to people, they immediately assume that it's a prank, because yeah, it looks like that, but this is real. This is a nearly complete version of the current state of things. Of course, it's a little bit behind, because these things are always trail reality. But if you notice the lower left side of it, I have 3 DynamoDB tables that this thing leverages. Now, DynamoDB purists are very insistent that single table design is the way of the future, and that's what people should be doing. And I spent about an hour trying to figure out how to make that work, and it could be done. And at the end of it, it was, wait a minute, why am I doing this? Because at the traffic levels that I get, 2 of those 3 tables get less than 100 reads and writes a week. And okay, that's not the end of the world there. And so I just set those to effectively like on-demand concurrency, and the cost for those things in a monthly bill rounds up to a penny.
Mm-hmm.
So then there's the third one that it's the click tracker, that every time someone clicks a link in the newsletter, I built a custom link tracker that doesn't track individual users, just the aggregates. Because I don't care if you personally click on a link. I care how many people in total clicked on a link, because that informs my content decisions. Wow, I don't give a crap about IoT, but an awful lot of other people do. I guess I better talk about it. I don't give a crap about Windows, and no one else does either. Great, I don't have to care. But that thing winds up going from sitting idle to thousands of hits in a 5-minute span, trailing off throughout the day, down to idle. And there's a scaling challenge there. I just said it's on demand, and I am leaving a bit of money on the table by doing that, as opposed to provisioning capacity. But it's costing me 7 cents a month, and I don't actually care. about that from an optimization point of view. Now, at scale, if suddenly instead of doing the click tracking for just my weekly newsletter, now it's the back end behind tinyurl.com, we're having a very different discussion and the economics radically change. At that point, there's a serious discussion to be had about Scylla. But today, it would cost me an order of magnitude to migrate this to Scylla. And it would not be the right decision to do that. And people love to have me come and give my opinions on this, but my opinions aren't for sale. If I thought it was a bad idea, you can't pay me to say otherwise. The other piece that I want to highlight here is I've done and why I find Scylla interesting as well. I've done the numbers on this. I can rewrite this entire system, which uses Lambda functions and a Route 53 database because I have problems, and 3 DynamoDB tables to work on any other large cloud provider and also Oracle Cloud in a day or so. And that includes the time it takes to redo the data architecture of the Lambda functions that talk to DynamoDB. That drops by many hours if I don't have to do that by using Scylla to effectively replicate those APIs elsewhere. Now, that doesn't mean I'm about to rush out to put this thing on another cloud provider because, again, there's no business value directly to me for doing that. But the fact that I don't have to think about, well, I like Dynamo, but I don't want to be locked in, so I'm going to use something else instead, was an incredible time saver. And again, when I built this, it was an experiment. I didn't build this expecting it to turn into what it did. That's how things work. In fact, one of those tables, because I'm terrible at this, is named click tracker-test. Because, yeah, I'm just going to do this as dev, and suddenly it's working. And, well, I'm not going to rebuild that into the production environment because there's the stories we tell on conference stage, which are also known as lies, and there's the real way software gets built.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, couldn't agree with you more. The on-demand pricing is excellent for it. That's why it exists, and like for such a use case with sometimes people have they measure activity in a day activity instead of measuring operation per second in days, in seconds, I'm sorry. And if you have this type of workload where you get tens of thousands or even 1 billion accesses a day in 24 hours, it's really not a lot. It means usually 1 billion means 10,000 requests per second on average. So it's not really a lot. And if you have unpredictable workload, it's just okay to use DynamoDB for it, even when Scylla exists. So no need to kind of over-engineer it. In general, kind of the rule of thumb is if you have a small data set, use relational technology. It's a better fit. You don't need to plan your queries ahead of time like you do need to do in DynamoDB. If you have a known kind of unpredictable workload and it's not huge, if it's huge, it's like you'll be you'll go bankruptcy with the on-demand. The on-demand is 40 times more expensive than Scylla. So if you have a spike, but a spike of that lasts for not a second, but lasts for an hour, or a spike that on-demand can't scale that much because it's confined to relatively tens of thousands of operation per second, can't really jump that fast to handle a spike, then on-demand is good. If it's more than that, and once you kind of know what your workload looks like, so if you know you're paying 7 cents, then don't bother. But if it's not 7 cents, if it's $700,000 a month or a year, then you're making the wrong choices, and it's time to move to a database that can do way better job. And you don't need to work around many times in Dynamo. You need to invest too much work. Like the single table design, I think that they're doing themselves a bad service because it's not that they must do a single table. They can.
It's code golf, really. It's the equivalent of like what's the fewest lines of code I can write something. It's a fun experiment, a contest you can run. But if that's how you're approaching production, what are you doing? Now, there are
Mhm.
cost wins and there are optimization wins in some cases. And that's what they give conference talks about. It's not just doing it for the sake of being clever. But the takeaway is that people who I should do a single table design. They don't capture that context and they start twisting themselves in knots trying to do something that makes no sense for them.
Yep.
DynamoDB fans, please don't email me.
Usually the single table design, I think it's related to directly to price performance, because the problem with once you do have bigger separate tables, in each tables you need to buy provisioned IOPS for it and to manage it. There's DynamoDB is kind of a serverless, fully managed database, but you need to work a lot in order to do that, to maintain it, to make sure that the cost is fine, to move between the pricing, to see that your requests are not throttles. If there are throttles, you need to, those who run a database at scale have lots of complication when choosing DynamoDB. And here Scylla can help, because our model is the single, with a single table. Basically, you need to provision the paper per operation thing is really convenient when you speak about low throughput, but when it's high, everything is important and everything has cost. So this is where you want to save. And with Dynamo, everything is isolated. With something like Scylla, that we're node based, where we have servers in the back actually. So these servers are yours. Once you buy them, then you can do whatever you like with these servers, and you can consolidate multiple tables, sometimes thousands of tables in a single cluster. And then you utilize all of the idle time, and you don't need to buy siloed provisioned for every table. So that's super convenient. And there are a bunch of other games that Dynamo forces you to do, like DAX, for example, the cache. And I wrote 2 years ago a blog about why you shouldn't place a cache in front of your database. Of course, if your database, if you really insist of using the same database, you must use a cache. But it makes life more complicated, and it's hard to synchronize the cache. Dynamo did a good job where they synchronize it for you, but the price remains high because it's cache is RAM and it's a separate layer, and that's not effective because database has cache in them. We cache, we use RAM inside. So the best, and the database also knows the access pattern. So the right thing is to have a database that can utilize the cache, and that's why it's just simpler many times to use Scylla in terms of, instead of using Dynamo and multiple tables or single table or DAX, etc. I think it's pretty similar to what people use Lambda with. You use Lambda, it's super convenient to use Lambda and run tons of computations with Lambda and spiky computations. But if you have a massive workload that, let's say, just like that, needs tens of servers, hundreds of servers, and even beyond, it doesn't make sense to use a Lambda function every time to start from scratch with a Lambda function. You need to have an application server that will context switch really fast.
Yeah, the right tool for the job is one of the themes that I find myself constantly revisiting. And I want to be aspirational and thought leader and say, when I talk to my customers, but it's a lie. I have to remind myself of that. When I'm writing code badly, I get locked into a certain way of thinking. And it's like when the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem looks like hours of fun. It's this problem of, just because it's the tool you're most familiar with may not make it the right answer. And for experiments and one-offs, sure, use the tool set you're comfortable with. At a certain point of scale, you really want to take a step back and make sure you're not going down the wrong path.
Mm-hmm. Actually, we've beaten price performance for not to death. I can spend lots of it, but I think it's enough. But if we're talking about using the right tools for the job, there's we see Kubernetes pretty much everywhere. Although ECS got decommissioned, but we'll still see Kubernetes everywhere. What's your point about what's your
Kubernetes
view
has
about
fallen in love with its own
Kubernetes?
complexity. It feels like it came out of Google possibly as another prank and caught on in some respects. And it feels like it's geared toward resume-driven development. It's like whenever they relax constraints around Lambda functions, or like letting them run longer, or giving them a bunch more RAM or something like that, it's the same type of thing. Whereas this enables a few really great, really awesome use cases and 100,000 terrible ones. And that's the ones that people trip over, where it's like, so what are you trying to build with Kubernetes? And the answer is invariably some form of my own resume. And it's incredibly complicated. It's difficult to wind up working with if you aren't already steeped in that space. The skill set is stupendously in demand. So if you're as a business choosing to run Kubernetes, understand that the staff who know what they're doing are not inexpensive. And looking at all of this, it's one of those, okay, so now we've sort of collectively deluded ourselves. And now we're talking about like the next step of, so I love these ideas of stateless ephemeral containers. How can I run a database in it? I don't want to hear that I have bad ideas about databases ever again compared to that.
um, Now, I must admit that I used to be more opinionated against Kubernetes, but over time I changed my mind. Um, Definitely, there are good and bad things about Kubernetes with databases. I'm not speaking about just a stateless application where Kubernetes really can bring lots of value, usually because of other things, but Kubernetes is super valuable there. I think even with the stateful Kubernetes, the state of Kubernetes today is such that can allow you to get value with it. Like it does things like a deployment of the same configuration across multiple pods, and also to restart these services in a really nice way. So usually, since I was also leading the KVM project, I kind of led people to say, just use the bare VM, and you have the AWS SDK or your Cloud SDK, and do it without, like maybe Kubernetes, just like that, is an okay solution on-prem where you don't have a fabulous hypervisor, but when you do, use the hypervisor. But there are cases where it feels additional. I'm not sure that there is a really nice API where you can restart multiple servers in a really convenient way that Kubernetes provides you. It also provides you a bunch of other things with all of the helper pods that you can run with it. So altogether, I believe that there are sometimes it's really the right tool and the right tool for the right environment. Also, if you already have if you are a Kubernetes shop, it's okay to add a database. If you're not a Kubernetes shop, don't start this is the last thing that you need to do. And also, even if you are a Kubernetes shop, try to resist and figure out what you're really getting with it. If you like to put your database in a Kubernetes environment, it also takes away, especially from a vendor like us, which is high performance, it takes away some of the performance. Sometimes it's also another complication just to get, it's not just with Scylla, just to get the logs and other things that you like to get done, or monthly DC that it goes in your way. But it has also lots of value. And right now we're working with a very big security company who decided to run a database per customer and not to run the database as a multi-tenant one due to security isolations. And Kubernetes makes sense for them because they have scales of thousands of customers. So we're speaking about thousands of clusters. So sometimes Kubernetes is a good solution. and we're offering it. So, but it doesn't come for free.
I would agree with most of what you said. And again, having me give annoyed takes about Kubernetes is a whole separate podcast we can do another time. But I have angry opinions about it. And it's a nuanced issue. I don't want to, if you're running Kubernetes, which a lot of folks are, I don't want you to feel bad for it. You haven't necessarily made a terrible decision. I'm just basically cranky about the entire space.
Yeah, that's right. I was once cranky with, I used to think that RPMs is the right thing to do, and packaging things in Docker container is super wrong because you don't know what you're packaging in there. But life proved me wrong, and it's also once you get to use it, both for Docker and also with Kubernetes with Scylla, it just very convenient. So, and you can't fight with convenient for those who are expert in it. And we have, I see that we have just 5 more minutes. Let's see if we have a Q&A either in your Twitter stream or things that we haven't answered. For Bilu asks about inconsistencies. It's too deep, and we won't be able to debug that inconsistency in the query. So please send an email or go to our Slack channel. Sorry. We do have about Kubernetes. We do have a Kubernetes operator GitHub project, and also we synchronize the documentation of that GitHub project to our website. We're about to GA our operator, and we're about to add many more supporting docs to simplify your deployment. So just expect it to come in the next kind of 4 weeks until our summit. But you should be functional just by following the examples in the docs. Any last question before we end? Seems like there's none. People can
someone did ask on Twitter at the beginning, like how I would compare it to Route 53 as a database. And I maintain that all databases pale contrasted with the glory that is Route 53 misused as a database. But once you remove that from that amazing option from the table, then for the right workload, I am enthused by what I'm seeing from Scylla. This is not me saying that I necessarily have a great use case for it immediately, but I love the capability story. I like what it points at, and it changes the discussion about lock-in specific to NoSQL options significantly for a number of my customers. In fact, one of our customers we have in common, Fanatics, they don't make poor decisions as a general rule. And they're obviously very thoughtful about what they do and how they do it. When I was working with them and looking at their account, at no point did I look around and say, this is dumb. Why'd you do that? They know what they're doing. And the fact that they are willing to have, to talk to you folks and use you in the way that they're using you is a testament to the product. I know I keep falling back on the social proof thing, but when it comes to databases, very often I talk to people I trust who are using these things. And when they say it's good, and they do, I believe them.
Fanatics, they shared the presentation in our last summit about their journey, that they moved from Cassandra and kind of saved 4x of their hardware, and we're just better. It's not just in terms of cost. And we see a lot of patterns where people come to us with a Cassandra conversion or a Redis conversion, sometimes with a MongoDB conversion. And after we're inside there, then we continue to convert other databases. And many times DynamoDB is the next one. So that's why we came up with, we decided to implement this API.
And looking across the board at my entire customer base, I've never yet had an engagement where I'm looking at the bill and do a, what the hell is that? And the answer was Scylla. It has never happened. And that's not because they're not using you folks, but it has never yet that I've ever seen been the, holy crap, this is expensive, we need to do something else.
Super. So let's call it a day. And thanks a lot for your time, Corey.
No, thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to hear the sound of my own voice.
And if folks want to catch up Corey on me, you know where to look. But bye-bye. Have a great day. Thank you for listening. Ciao.